All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. We are excited to share some things with you here about Okta workflows. My name is Evan Byrnes. I'm the IT director at Blue Voyant. This is one of our system engineers, Ventura. Ventura Torres is a big hand in creating some of the workflows that we're going to demonstrate for you today. Blue Voyant is a cybersecurity company based out of New York. If you may not be familiar with us, we are very hopeful that you will be shortly. For the second consecutive year, we were just named Microsoft's U.S. Security Partner of the Year. I'm very proud of that. A lot of the work that Ventura and I have done with our team, I think, has contributed to that. Because as we all know, if our endpoints don't work, then our workers don't work. So those are the sorts of things that make me very happy as a director. Ventura is going to take over for a little bit here and explain what Okta Workflows is and how we use it and when and why maybe you all should use it.
Yeah, hello everybody. So, what is Okta Workflows? According to Okta themselves, it is an Okta-provided service that is an interface-driven platform for the automation of business processing using a library of integrated third-party applications and functions. So basically, it's a no-code to low-code application that you could use to automate tasks. It's comparable to Power Automate or other services out there such as Zapier, but for this presentation we'll be talking about Okta Workflows. And the costs of what license version that you can use are up on the screen there, and the link is provided there in case you're interested to see what tier level you may qualify for depending on your current license. So why would you use Okta Workflows? Well, Okta Workflows makes it easy to automate identity processes at scale without writing code. And it uses an if-then-that logic that Okta's pre-built connector library and the ability to connect to any publicly available API to enable anyone to innovate with Okta. And if you use Okta as your source of truth, it's very helpful to have it and integrate with it, whether you're provisioning or deprovisioning workflows. And yes, I am reading out of the slides a little bit, and I apologize. So when should you use Okta Workflows? Well, we recommend, first of all, to use best practices. Just because you can use Okta Workflows doesn't necessarily mean you should be using Okta Workflows, especially with Okta's pre-built connectors already integrated, such as adding rules that may be a more ideal solution for what you're trying to automate. So here are some examples that Okta themselves have provided on what Okta Workflows would be ideal for, such as customizing an employee and partner lifecycle or simplifying IT tasks, improving security posture, automating time-sensitive use cases, and sending automated communications or alerts to others, which we're going to actually do some of these later on in the presentation. So what are the requirements for Okta Workflow? Well, first off, you need access to Okta. And you all also will need to be an admin, to be more specific, a super admin, and you will need to have API permissions necessary for any of the workflows that you're trying to establish, as well as you'll want to have not just because you're a super admin doesn't mean you have Okta Workflows yet. So you'll also want to make sure that you have set up the provisioning app necessary for Okta Workflows. And we highly recommend that you set up a dev environment if you don't have one. Okta does make it available for you, so you could set up a dev environment and play around with it instead of playing in production, as we all hope you all do not do. So, what are the limitations of Okta Workflow? Well, it is a web-based application, which means you have no internet, no way to get to it or adjust things. But there are occasional Okta outages. We haven't had many this year, but they do occur and they do happen, so we be wary of that. And it also, unlike other no-code, low-code applications, you're not able to run any scripts. There are other applications out there that can run Python scripts or JavaScripts, but not Okta Workflows. You can do other third-party API calls, but you can't run an actual Python script or Bash script or shell, etc. So, to get started, here's what we recommend you do. First off, let's make a plan. Secondly, check out what is already out there by checking out the Okta templates. Let's not reinvent the wheel here. And Okta does a great job of providing many different workflow templates that you could use to be able to automate tasks. And expect that your plan will change as our work is dynamic, so is our planning. So also, we highly recommend you please test again, and after you're done testing, test again, just to be sure. And use service accounts. Very important, especially when making third-party API calls. Very important that they come through, and when you're sending automated alerts, we don't want it coming from somebody that is already within the company, because we say that from experience. Don't want to do that. So here are some things we like to do when we get started. First off, we would try using Postman. Does everybody here know what Postman or have heard of what Postman is? Yeah? Okay. So, great tool. It's free to use, and it's great for testing out your API calls before you actually implement them. We don't recommend trying to make your first API call through Okta workflows. Maybe try using it through Postman just to ensure that they work correctly, so that you have that part of your workflow put out. And also communication. Alert your team that you've prepared an Okta workflow and how it works. You don't want to create automation to replace manual tasks and then have your team still complete them manually, right? And we do this internally. For example, whenever we create an Okta workflow, we have a Slack channel dedicated so that everybody in our IT team and related parties that may be interested could see what we've done, so that they could start using the automations if we set one up. And of course, documentation. We highly recommend that you document your processes and your Okta workflows. And Okta Workflows allows you to use native app connections. They actually have a huge library of 60 plus native app connections, and each app varies in how you authenticate to it. But don't worry, if you don't know how to do it, they have lots of documentation that will walk you through how you could establish your connection between Okta Workflows and the app that you're trying to establish. And Okta support will assist with configuring all native app connections. And we say that from experience. Their support is pretty great. And they will not create the workflow for you, but they will assist you with the flow that you are creating. So it's good to know. And it also allows you to use custom API connections, which allows us to authenticate using different methods. When you create your own custom API connection, you could use basic authentication, custom authentication using a header and header value, or OAuth, or just simply select none. And why you may want to select none could be because within the workflow itself, you could have the ability to create your own custom select custom card, and then be able to create your own custom API call. So now I'm going to hand it over to Evan to go over the interface of Okta.
Yep. Now that Ventura has shown you some of the explanations of how these things work, we can show you the interface so that when we get into some examples, you have a better idea of what exactly we're looking at here. And one of the first things that's super important to understand is the difference between an event, an app action, and a function. And an event is something that tells this workflow to start. It could be something like a schedule. You can time it on a certain interval, on a specific day, whatever you want to do there. It can be an action that happens within one of these applications that you're integrating, whether it be a message sent to a specific Slack channel or an account moved into a specific group. All of these things will tell Okta Workflows to start working through whatever flow you've created for them. And then once that happens, the actions start to take place, and that's where things actually happen. There are a lot of things that overlap between an event and an action. For example, it looks as though Okta should be able to do things like an activation is recognized, except there's a difference between telling it that an account was activated and telling it to activate an account. So while they sound very, very similar, they're not interchangeable, but Okta's gone to the lengths to make sure that you can't transpose them. So functions will look the same, but it'll be a little bit different in each place. And as you can see here, these are some of the actions that are available. So you can trigger other things. You can use the native apps that are integrated. There are a number of different ways to get your apps to work with each other. And that's what the action will do. And then here is an example of that. Each one, if you can look closely there, will show the same types of API calls that you can make manually. So similar to the things that you might see in a collection or an environment in Postman will be available here. We have, I would say, high 90% of functionality with these native applications, but there are some that will tell you, no, I don't have that ability yet. One of those sorts of things is the new ability to introduce laps into a Jamf environment. That command is not yet available here, but within the Jamf action, there is a custom API call. So you can fill out that information and still use that connection and that authorization that you've already established. And the same goes for Google. Most everything is there, but not everything, but you do have the ability to interchange that connection and authorization. And in the event that your app doesn't natively integrate with Okta, you can just use a custom API action and you can specify everything that you need. So if there's something that you only need to interact with once, or you just can't configure permanently, you can go ahead and do any of the standard API calls there as well. And then the last part of this interface, the initial layout of it, are functions. And functions you can sort of think of as data manipulation. So all of these applications will give us response codes and response data, but it doesn't actually do anything with that data any different than if you were to call from A to B. It's just the way that it is. But you can take a call, and if you get a call for a user's name and you want to start pulling out attributes in Okta, you can take that field, whatever it may be, and start pumping it into other areas. You can strip the data out, you can transpose it and manipulate it into such a way that it will do exactly what you want to do. In addition to that, it will also allow you to do things like if-else statements. So if you get to a point and you're expecting this data and it's not there, you can tell that flow to shut down, and that's it. We don't need any more from you. If you get data in a format that's not right, you can use these functions to strip it down and convert it to the format that will suit the needs of this workflow. And then here is the default view. This is called Flow View. This is what the interface looks like primarily. It will just be a series of cards, and it works in chronological order. So whatever's on the left is the beginning, and whatever's on the right is the end. And there'll be easy drag and drop to connect these along the way that we'll get into. But this is the look that you'll primarily work out of. But we also wanted to show you that the spider web effect that you see here are the mappings. So in this case, we went to the Okta card on the far left here, and we grabbed the ID slide, and then we dropped it into several other locations throughout the workflow. And part of the reason that this is really good is if you get a complex workflow and you don't know where that data is coming from, you can hover over it and it will tell you exactly where it came from. And the other thing that's really good about this is if you don't know that this is available there, or you couldn't find where it originally was pulled from, you'd then have to make subsequent API calls. And fewer API calls are generally better than more. So if you already have the data available, it doesn't make sense to go pull it again, and these mappings will help ensure that everything works correctly for you. The other view that's available is Flowchart View, and this one is very good to a certain extent. If the workflow itself is super, super extensive, you're going to get a bizarrely tiny little workflow chart that is not super helpful, and you can zoom in forever, and it's still not super helpful. But for basic functions, this is something super easy that you could share with your help desk and say, this is what this does, and this is how it works. And that communication helps them know what's going on without actually having to get into Okta workflows. Okta workflows itself isn't inherently dangerous, but the people that use it may be. So And then finally, as long as you save the function that Ventura is going to show you shortly here, you will have this flow history view. By default, this is not on. It will not store any data. It'll just process everything as is. Sometimes you may process a lot, and you don't need this history once everything's working. But during the initial testing, if you're getting errors, by saving this data, you'll be able to go back and you can see green check marks next to everything that worked correctly, and you'll see a red circle next to everything that didn't, and you'll understand exactly why it didn't work. You'll have the error codes, and then you can troubleshoot it from there to understand what you need to do to get it from broken to working. And now Ventura is going to show you how these things actually work in motion.
Thanks, Evan. So let's create a basic workflow. In this workflow, we want to create a specific Slack or notify a specific Slack channel of new onboards anytime a new user has been added to any one of the 3 specific groups that we're going to point out. And we want to make sure everyone in the channel is alerted, and we want to dynamically display their name, email, and manager of the user that has been added within that notification. So how would we go about doing that? Well, the first thing we want to do is check out the Okta workflow connections. So we will do this by first establishing the connections between Okta workflow and the application that we want to use, which in this situation, you do have to establish a connection within Okta. It doesn't occur automatically. This is something you have to do manually, but once it's set, it's there, and you're ready to go going forward, as well as establish a connection with Slack. Once those 2 connections have been established, then we could actually get into creating the workflow. And so when you go and select create new workflow, the first thing that it's going to ask you to do is ask you to set up a trigger. And in order to get to this, we pointed out in the slides how to get to it, but in this situation, we're going to select the user added to group from the Okta application templates to be the trigger, to be the start of this workflow. And this is how, as you could see, the card will look like. And what this will do is essentially anytime a user has been added to any Okta group, it will start the trigger. So then, we obviously don't want it to run every time a user has been added to a group. We want it to run whenever it's been added to one of 3 specific groups. So that is when we add the function from the Okta's pre-built connector library. And the specific function that we want to use in this situation will be the else if connector library. The reason we want to use that is because it allows us to select multiple statements versus just having 2. And in this situation, we want to set up 3. So let's move forward with that function. So for every if or else if condition slide, the display name that from the Okta read card located under groups _ display name, which is basically right here, we'll want to drag and drop that under the conditions section of the if and else if conditions. And we'll want to define the condition to be the display name of the Okta group has to equal whatever Okta group you want it to be, which in this situation would be Okta group 1, 2, and 3. And you will specify the names within the value B field. So once you've done that, you'll want to duplicate the steps for all of them, except for the very last card. The way the Okta workflows works is the else if statements. The very last card, referred to as else, is obviously going to capture anything that is left remaining. The downside is you cannot add a condition for it. It's intended to be a catch-all for any condition that you specify. So we'll have to add yet another card within that condition, and we want to add the continue if card to the very last else statement. The continue if card will be able to imitate what we did with the other 2 conditions, which is to specify to only continue if it's one of the 3 specified Okta groups. So we've already specified Okta group 1 and 2, and under the else section, we'll put the continue if card, and we'll specify Okta group number 3. And now we want to add actions to each one of these conditions that we've established. So now that we've told Okta, okay, only move forward if it's one of these 3 groups. So what do you want to do? So we've already established the user added to group, but now we want to find out who is the user that was added if it's been added to one of the 3 groups. So to do that, you'll select the read user card from the Okta library, and then you'll want to make sure within the options section that you check that you want to see the output of the first name of the user, the last name of the user, their email address, and manager, because these are things that we want to be able to capture and be able to use later on in the workflow. And then you will be asked to enter a value within the field, and that is when you would drag and drop within each condition the ID section, which is right here for every Okta user, into the read user section. So that is how Okta will be able to see, okay, the user that was just added, let's get more information about them. So this is how that has been captured, and now we can move forward to adding the next section, which is to select the send message card for Slack. And what this will do is gonna allow us to tell Slack what Slack channel we want to send the message to. And on the channel field is where you would enter whatever Slack channel that you want to do. So it could be sales teams, it could be the marketing group, it could be whatever group that these 3 Okta groups are normally a part of because they were onboarded normally. Okay, so now that we've established who the user is, we've established where we're going to send the message to, now we want to compose that message. So that is when we go into the Okta functions library, and we're going to select compose. And from the Okta connector library, you'll be able to create your own message. And we want to start the message with the @here section, because the @here card is how you notify every user within a Slack channel that a notification's been sent, and that's what we would want to do. So we started off with @here, and you literally just have to drag and drop the output from the users, from the read user card onto where exactly you want it in the message. And as you could see within the screenshot here, all you have to do is literally grab that slide and drag it and drop it into where you want it within the message, and then compose your message here. And after the message has been composed, you'll want to grab the output of that message and literally just simply drag it and drop it onto the text field of the message. So that is how we've told Okta, okay, here's the message, and here is what we want it to go, where we want it to go. It's as simple as that. And not that we don't know or aren't sure that you guys know how to save. We added a slide here for saving because, as Evan already mentioned, within the save function, there is a button there where it says save all data that passes through the workflow. That option is not turned on by default. We strongly encourage you to turn it on in order for you to be able to log your events and be able to trace back and see how the workflow went through instead of just getting an error message. So now that we've saved our workflow, we'll run it, and the workflow will appear to look like this. At the top section, you could see the notification said that the user test has been added to the group, along with their email address and the manager that they will be replying to there. So that is what everybody within the Slack channel will see. Below that is what you would see as the admin within, now that we've saved the log section, you will be able to see of what exactly went through. And as you could see, everything was successful. Everything from the moment that the user was added to the point that it saw that it belonged to one of the 3 Okta groups. It read that user, composed the message for you, and sent it to the Slack channel. And that's it. You created your first workflow. And it's as simple as that. So now let's try something a little bit more advanced. Let's automate Jam SelfHeal functionality. Let's put it on a schedule, and let's have a Jam Smart Group in place to scope this task to, so that it's only scoped to computers that either have not been checking in for a very long time or have not updated inventory, or if their framework appears to be kaput. Well, you can create a smart group for that. And in case you have zero-touch provisioning, which we do in this situation, we don't want the zero-touch provisioning to start to apply to this computer with the enrollment flag. So what we'll do is also add these computers into a static group and exclude it from being auto-provisioned. And lastly, we want to log our actions. So we want to create a JIRA ticket so the service desk knows what computers we've attempted to fix a problem with. And obviously, we want to be able to keep documentation, and this is a great way to automate it. So first and foremost, what is Jam SelfHealing functionality? Well, as Dr. K pointed out in her blog, which we strongly encourage you to read, it's a great way to get familiar with Jam SelfHeal in detail. But basically, it's using Jam's Pro API, where you can redeploy the Jam management framework to manage computers. And if for some reason a computer stops checking in with Jam Pro or running policies, this functionality allows you to remotely re-enroll the computer, just as long as it's still receiving MDM commands. So it's a great tool. If you haven't used it before, we strongly recommend it. But how would you go about doing it? Well, through the interface, you would first need to go into Jamf, obtain the computer ID from the asset number, and once you've obtained the computer ID, then you would have to go into Jamf's API, not the classic one, but the new version, and be able to authenticate to obtain that bearer token. Once that bearer token has been obtained, then you could scroll down to where it says Jamf Management Framework, and expand that, and so enter the computer ID field within the proper field, and then click the execute button. That will send the MDM push command needed to re-enroll the computer and create a new, and reinstall a new management framework for Jamf. Now let's avoid doing this 20 times or more possibly within your system. And this is going to be a slightly more complex Okta workflow, because it's going to be composed of 2 workflows. One is going to be the parent flow, and the second one will be the child flow, which basically the first flow is going to waterfall some information into the second flow that will give the actions for that we want to run for every single one of these computers, which in this case would be pushing the Jam SelfHeal command. And to reiterate the requirements, we want to put it on a schedule. We're going to assume everybody here already knows how to create a Jam Smart Group and a Jam Static Group, so we won't be going over that, but we will be going over how you could add them within Okta workflows to a specific Smart Group and a specific Static Group. And we want to create a JIRA ticket for every one of these. So let's get started with it. The first thing we want to do is check our connections, which we already did in our previous step, which is the good thing about Okta workflows. Once you get already started and using it, you already have all these pre-built connections established. You don't have to do them again. So you could go straight to creating the workflow. So with this workflow, we need to establish a trigger. And in this situation, we're going to go to the Okta Connect Functions library and select a scheduler. And the scheduler allows us, as you can see in the screenshot, to select many different times and days. So we could select the frequency of how often we want this workflow to run. So we want it to run every Monday, weekly, at 5 p.m. Eastern time. So that is what we selected. And all you have to do is simply hit save. And then the next thing we'll want to do is, at that time, we want to go to Jamf and look at a specific smart group. We already established a smart group to determine which computers appear to be broken and need the Jam SelfHeal Push so that they could start checking back in properly. Well, we could do that by going into the Read Computer Group card under the Jamf Library connector. And once you've selected that, you'll have the option to enter the smart, literally just simply enter the smart group name, and that's it. Once the smart group name has been established, then we obviously we know it's going to be multiple computers. Maybe you have, maybe you have 20, maybe you have 50, maybe even 100 computers, depending on how long it's been since you last looked into it, or for many other reasons. So that is when we want to select the for each function. It's right there in the title. The for each function from the Okta connector library. And the for each function will allow us to essentially be able to tell Okta workflows, hey, these computers within this group, please look at this list and output this particular information from that list. And the information that could be outputted from the list is displayed below here. And all you have to do is literally drag and drop the information you want into the record and state sections fields, which are right here. So in this situation, we want to capture the serial number of every computer that is going there. So now that we've established that we're capturing the serial number, where is it going to go? Well, that is where the option right here to create a new workflow is. And so that workflow is also known as a helper flow or a child flow, depending on what you want to call it. So this helper flow or this child flow will allow us to process each serial number that we just told it to document and tell it to run under a separate process. And what you would need to do under that new process is select helper flow, establish the record and state objects, and the reason why you want to do that is because we put them under the record and state fields already within Okta. So what we're essentially telling this card to do is grab every single serial number and one at a time run these actions. So what are the actions we want to do? Well, it's the Jam SelfHeal Push. So what we want to do first is obtain that computer ID, just like we did manually before, but we want to automatically do it. And we do that by telling it to read the computer serial number and gather more information about it. Once that information is established, you could select what type of output or what information you want to capture from it. And as you could see, it includes the ID. And we want to add to in this next card we want to add is to add that group to the static group. So we've already checked the smart group. Now we want to add it to the static group so that that static group is already within Jamf and under an excluded policy so that the zero touch provisioning does not automatically apply for the user. So in order to do that, you would select the Add Computer to Static Group card and literally just have to drag and drop the serial number record from here to there. Or you could drag it from the record section to there. It's up to you. Technically that would work, but in this situation, we're using the Jamf output connector just because if something goes awry, this is where the workflow will end and we could check our logs and see why it couldn't read the computer library. But in our experience, that hasn't happened. So this is a pretty sturdy workflow. So the next thing we want to do is obtain the bearer token. Now, The Jamf connector does not have the ability to query the new API, just the classic API within Okta. So we have to use a custom card within the within the Jamf connector, or you could select custom API. It's up to you. It will give you the same end result, which is basically to do a post action for obtaining the bearer token. And if you're not sure what URL to enter, you could always just go back to the Jamf API and capture it from the request URL section. And all you literally have to do is copy and paste that URL into the URL section of the custom API. Now, that URL that we captured will allow us to obtain the bearer token. So now that we've captured the bearer token, now we can move forward with the logic needed to push the Jam SelfHeal API push. And that will be composed of 3 cards. The very first one is to create the URL. That URL is going to be dynamic because of the computer ID we want to capture. So what we want to do is concatenate both the URL and the ID into one, so the URL string includes at the very end the computer ID. So to do that, we select the concatenate option, or the merge option, for those who weren't sure what concatenate means, like me when I first saw it. So when you merge that URL together, then you're able to get the output and name it something that you understand, or create a note. Then we want to compose the header in a JSON format so that you can be able to post that API call. So we've already obtained the bearer token in the previous URL. So what's going to happen is, if you notice the token section is in blue, that means I literally dragged and dropped the token you output from the custom API previously shown here at the very bottom of this, and I moved it to the compose section of the card. So that way we are telling Okta, hey, this is the bearer token, and the bearer token, of course, expires after 30 minutes. So every time this push runs, you can ensure that you're using a token that is valid. And we want to name the output of this in something that you would understand. I named it bearer token, and we want to put it in JSON format because it is an HTTP header. And lastly, we make the API call. And we do all that's left to do now that we did all the heavy lifting, which is to concatenate the URL and compose the header. Now we literally just have to drag and drop the URL and the headers into the proper sections, and that's it. Now we're ready to do the API call, but we're not quite done with the workflow yet. We still want to create a ticket for it. So after the API call has been made, now we want to start capturing some information so that we could create the ticket. The first thing we want to do is capture the date and time that push was sent so that we could record it in the ticket. And we're going to do this by going into, again, the functions library within Okta and selecting the date feature. And once we select the date feature, we're going to be able to then compose a subject line for the ticket. And we could see that we want some dynamic information from there. We could see that we want to capture the serial number as well as the full name of the user that this computer belongs to. So once we have that information composed together, which again you do by just simply dragging and dropping the previous slide cards from the read computer Jamf card into the compose field. And if you're lost as to where you are, all you have to do is hover over it and the mapping will show you where that card that you selected from is. And now we're going to create the logic needed to be able to create the ticket and close it out with the information we want. So all that's left to do is, again, just simply drag and drop the Jamf summary into the Jira the ticket into the subject line under the summary field. And we're going to capture the issue ID and move it over to the issue ID tracker so that as soon as we create this ticket, we could close it out into a done state. But we also want to log what the information we wanted. And as you could see here, we add a comment that it was auto-closed by Okta Workflows. So Service Desk knows that this was an automated task for future reference. And that's it. Now we're ready to actually run the workflow for the Jam SelfHeal. So when you run it, this is what the output will look like. The ticket subject line will contain the computer serial number, which has been redacted for security purposes, and it gives us the date and time from which we ran it, which is exactly what we wanted, to be able to capture the date and time and the serial number of the computer. I think I previously said the full name of the user. I'm sorry, what I meant to say was capture the full date and time for that user, because we already have that information in Jamf. So it's up to you. You could also capture the user's name and put it on there. You just have to have had to drag and drop that slide onto the compose field before. And that's it. We could see that it was successful, and the Jamf management Selfheal Push was able to go through as many computers that had that, and it's all been logged. Now let's get into something a little bit more complicated but more helpful, which is offboarding automation, which my colleague Evan will take over.
Thank you. So at this point, you may all be thinking or checking your Sketch calendars going, I thought this was security related. And I think in general, we think of security as building walls to keep the bad guys out. But sometimes the bad guys are inside the walls because we all make mistakes. Who's ever made a mistake that impacted a user? Well, the rest of us who did raise our hands would like to thank everybody else who didn't, and welcome to the exciting world of IT, because the accident reaper is coming for you. It happens to everybody. We want to avoid that, and that's what the automation does for us. I don't like offboardings. I don't like any sort of tedious task. I'm sorry, Sadiq, he's my CISO. He likes us doing things, but he's very encouraging. He has us do these automations so that we can free up our time for things that, generally speaking, are more interesting for us. And when I started, we had a checklist for our offboardings, and it took me about 40 minutes to get through to make sure all the hygiene was done, because I was the new guy and I wasn't going to mess it up. I wanted to be very, very deliberate about every step. Except one of the steps said, remove all apps from Google for this user. And I found a prompt that said, remove all apps. Except I removed it for the whole company. So for 15 minutes, we were no longer a Google organization. So the idea here is that I get to take this trivial task for me that eats up my time, and I get to create some reliability and some consistency to it. And that, for us, is what real security is. If we know that we're doing all the things the way they're to be done, then we don't have to worry about human error. So these are the areas where this particular workflow is going to help us on a day-to-day basis. When I did get comfortable with this, it still took me about 20 minutes to work through this entire process. And as I mentioned, it's super, super important that it's consistent. But there's also part of our offboarding where we were missing data and we were not storing things, or we thought things were being stored, and all of this was in scattered places with no consistency, and we're mostly remote. So we'd get computers back with no lock codes, which meant we spent a lot of money on a computer that is worth nothing, and then we paid to ship it around the world after it's worth nothing. We want to avoid all that and make sure that all of this works the way it should so that we can continue to deliver the same experience start to finish. So very, very beginning here, the way that we do this, and you'll notice some things and there'll be some questions that you'll go, well, why do you do it this way? And I'll try to go over most of that, but for this particular workflow, our trigger is to move a user into a group called Deactivate. It's the only thing we use that group for. It's the only time we ever use it. Anybody in here that is familiar with Okta workflows may know that you can set the trigger based off of a user moved into a specific group. When we made this, that didn't work. The consistency was very, very minimal. So instead, we say any group. And it's not the most efficient way, but I can promise you it works every time. So it will then read the user's groups to see everything that they're in, and then it'll take this pluck command and start to manipulate the data as I mentioned before, and it'll use flatten to convert it and stringify to change it into the format so that the other functions of Okta Workflow can actually read its contents. And eventually it'll get to the point where it will look for deactivate in the list of groups that are assigned to that user. And then it'll put it into a field and pass it along to a continue if. So it will say, oh, this user was moved into a group. Let me see if it was moved into deactivate. Oh, it wasn't? All right, we're done. Nothing else to see here. And all that's logged for us, so we have that if we need it. But if they do get moved into that group, that list will show that group, and then it'll continue through the process. And what we took as our approach is to try to get the most accessible function to least accessible function as part of this process. So instinctually, we thought, well, let's lock their account. Let's deactivate Okta. Except there are functions within Okta that won't let you update their user attributes if that account is deactivated. So then the next logical step for us was to start collecting some information. And we've had some users leave and some come back. We've had users who had access to certain things that nobody else in the company did, and then we had to scramble to figure out how to get them back in there. And originally, we would strip them of all the applications and all the groups, and we wouldn't know what they had. And if time went by and the logs were erased, then that was the end of it. We could guess, but we couldn't be sure. So now, as part of a maintenance, at the very beginning, we go through and we look at all the applications that are assigned to the user, and we look at all the groups that are assigned to the user, and we store those variables for later in the workflow. We then start to read the user because we need a little bit more information from them as we work through this process, and then we generate a random number. And the keen-eyed among you may see that that character limit for the random number is the exact same limit that we use for passcodes on Jamf when we lock devices. All of our users are remote, and some leave on good terms and some leave on bad, but it's our job to make sure that when they don't work for us, they don't have access to our hardware anymore. I don't know about any of you. I don't know if this is true at all, but psychologically, I feel like when I have to come up with a random number, I come up with the same random numbers all the time. Now I don't have to do that anymore. I have a robot that does it for me. So then we start doing an if-else, like Ventura had mentioned earlier, and we read their user attributes within Okta, and we try to determine if they are a contractor or a full-time employee, because not all of our contractors get computers. All of our full-time employees do, and maybe there's some parts of this workflow that don't apply to them, so we don't have to run those. As I mentioned before, we don't want to do API calls if we don't have to do API calls. So assuming that this offboarding that we're demonstrating now is a full-time employee, it goes through and it puts a little note there to say that they are an employee, and then it starts to read their Jamf profile because we want to get a list of their computers. They may have more than one, they may only have one, but we don't have to search for it ourselves anymore. We don't have to lock it ourselves anymore because it's going to go and pull that list of serial numbers for us. And then it's going to convert it into such a way that we can pass it along to a helper flow. And helper flows are probably the trickiest part or most challenging part for me when I was first starting, because I could go in and I could tell it I wanted to create a helper flow from the primary, and it would say, okay, yeah, sure, go ahead, do that. But then when I would choose the variables to pass along, nothing would happen. And as you may know, the Okta workflow documentation from Okta is not super strong. You can look up what does find do, and it will say it finds things. Like, oh, well, that's good. That's marginally better than my dictionary. Thanks, guys. So I eventually realized you have to make the child flow before you can introduce it into the primary one. And as we all know, children come before parents, so that makes perfect sense, right? Doesn't. But that's just one thing I wanted to share with you. So what we do, as you can see, is we start to pass the computer ID in the first field and the lock code, so that when we go to this for each ignore errors helper flow, it will pass a passcode that was randomly generated to Jamf to lock that particular computer with. And if they have more, it'll run through the whole list, and I don't have to worry about any of that. So as long as we keep everything in inventory correctly, which we're pretty good about, it triggers all of this. So now we know they're locked out of their computer. That's great. That's a good start. The next part is this next flow here on the right. We are 100% VPN all the time. You can't get to most of our services without VPN. So we move that computer into a static group in Jamf so that it then becomes excluded from the configuration profile that provides VPN access. So if by chance somehow this lock command fails, we know we have this backup so that they're not going to be able to access things directly anymore. So we're working through this process, like I said, from most visible to the user back to best disconnection for us. And this is that lock command that we send. Super simple. It's literally, this is the whole thing. That's all it does. It gets the two variables, computer ID and lock code, and then it passes it to Jamf in the next card to do the process. And then the same exact thing happens with this one to move it into a static group. The only difference here is under ID on the right side, we have the ID of that group because that's never going to change. We're never going to have to pull that dynamically. Works for us. No issue there. So now that we're done with Jamf, we can start moving on to other things. And here we'll clear all of their Okta sessions because now that we know they can't use their computer, we'll make sure that they're not signed in somewhere else if somehow that happened. And then we reset their password. Now we know that they can't sign in even if they try to sign back in. And then on the next portion here, you can see that we've created a relative URL so that we can send a custom API command. And we found that in certain cases, whenever we would reactivate an account for one of those situations I mentioned earlier, tracking down an old email or a file in Google Drive, because we had their personal email in the secondary email field, they would then get an email saying, hey, your account's been activated. Welcome to Blue Voyant. Not a great look for us, for employees that don't work for us anymore. But you can't change that field once the account's deactivated. There's no way to do it. So this is where we start to see not just the logic of it, but the function of it and how you have to be very thoughtful and deliberate and you have to revisit things. And as Ventura mentioned earlier, we set out with a plan and the workflow we ended up with accomplishes the same thing, but in a very different way than we had expected. You'll also notice that we set the email address to null@null.com because, as we know, certain fields only accept certain types of text, and if it's not right, it's invalid. So all of our off-boarded users share a single email address that doesn't exist, I think. I don't know. And now we can start moving on to more portions of the Google offboarding. And here we want to read the user so that we can start to get their information about their Google profile. We did recently move away from Google to Microsoft, but in the interest of showing something that's thoroughly tested, we went with the older workflow, but we are on Microsoft now. It aligns a little bit better for us. But it goes along and it generates a 22 random character password, and then it changes that password too. But for whatever reason, we needed to make it wait for 10 seconds. Some point it just was going way too fast, and the only way we could get it to work was to say, hold on, slow down, take a second. All right, go ahead, we're good. And then it just will reset the password. Super, super simple. We create another relative URL for the same purpose for their Google profile, because if they set up a secondary password of their own, they could try to make an attempt to recover that Google account, and they shouldn't be able to, but our goal is to strip away all the possibilities so that we can have that reliability and that confidence that we set out for. So it will then push just the same in a different way. In this particular example, we can type in null, and null is fine. Google's okay with that. And under email, the address type for home is the equivalent of a secondary email address in Okta. So we can blank out that stuff so that they can't try to use a secondary email address to recover the account or their personal cell phone number or something like that. We also have groups within Google that we don't want them to have access to, and it's all about stripping away all of that access. So it reads that information as well, and again, we'll work through each. And you may notice that it says ignore errors. We have it set that way for two reasons. One, we're very confident that this works. We don't really run into errors. Two, if an error does occur, it shuts down the Okta workflow right then and there. It doesn't try to continue because it assumes everything that comes after a certain point is based off whatever is currently happening. So it may be completely unrelated to the rest of it. It doesn't care. That's it. And that's not great for offboarding. So in the interest of making sure everything is done, we set it this way. But as I mentioned, we have not had any errors with any of these at any point. We've had errors with other things in other areas, but not here. And this is a little bit closer view of how that looks there. So you can see, to go to the right, to go to the left, that this is the primary workflow, and we take that username field and we assign it to email address. So this data becomes this data over here, and the same as ID becomes group key, and then it starts passing that information there. It's really, really cool on how it works, but not super obvious on how to get this set up. But those templates that Ventura mentioned can be repurposed. You can export things, you can import things, so you can start in testing and then move it to production. But you can also be sure that you're going to have a way to get some starting points for some of these things. All right, and now here we want to remove any app-specific passwords. Again, some of our users were using Google MDM. We don't want any of our data there, and if we remove the app-specific password, we can start revoking some of those things to pull back some of that stuff that belongs to us, and it again works through one of those helper flows. We also have some users who are admins, and admins having admin rights, even if they're gone, probably isn't best practice. So we use another custom call to go and update their access. We demote anybody who's an admin to a standard user. It's all pretty straightforward from here on out. And then as part of that initial MDM process I mentioned, we also read their mobile devices and then say, nope, you're done. We're going to pull that back too. Thanks, we'll see you. And it will work through that list as it goes. And then we deactivate the account. We don't necessarily have to do it at this stage. We have Okta provisioning and deprovisioning set up for Google accounts so that it will disable that on its own. But again, we want to make sure it happens when we want it to happen and not when Okta or another system wants it to happen. Essentially, all of those things become uneditable if we already did the Okta deactivation and then the deprovisioning is done. We can't edit any of that. So now that the Google access is gone, we can finally do the Okta deactivation. So as I mentioned, we set out thinking, oh, Okta's our source of truth. It controls everything. Let's shut that down first. We're good to go. And it doesn't work that way. A lot of this is security based off logic more than the technical side of things. We also want to keep track of when it happened. We are a global company. We have people working almost around the clock all over the place. So when people are offboarded, we want to make sure that it's done at the correct time. So that time is logged for us. And then all of that data that we pulled earlier, so the serial numbers, the Okta groups, the Okta applications, the Google groups, all of that is stored within the Okta workflow. And now we can push that out so that we have a record of that we can review at any point in time. And this is the first one. We actually have two Google Sheets that it outputs the data to. And the first one will tell us the time, the user's full name, the user's email address, and then any Okta apps that they had access to. So this one is very rarely used, but having the data is usually better than not having the data. So we'll zoom in on this one a little bit here, but this essentially does the same sort of thing, but instead of that type of data, we get the date of the offboarding, the full name, the username, list of Google groups, list of Okta groups, list of serial numbers, and most importantly for me at this point is the passcode that we use to lock the computers with. Now we know that Jamf puts those logs into Jamf, but after a period of time, those disappear. So if a user doesn't send us a computer back in time, we can't really count on that. If one of us types in the passcode wrong either on Jamf or in our records, we can't count on that either. And now we don't have to generate the code or wonder where it is. And then it takes all of this, and originally we put it into a Slack message, but that was a huge problem for us because there's a limit to how much data you can push through a Slack message, and some of these users had enormous groups. So we'd put them into the deactivation group, and then the Slack message would never come through. what we've done instead is pin those two spreadsheets to the Slack channel so that they're accessible from the same place. And then we have a brief message here that tells everybody that the offboarding is complete, all the data is stored, and then they can access that confirmation there as well as at the top. And this enables our help desk to do deactivations as well, because now we are really the only two that actively use Okta workflows. There's a lot of danger in there if it's used incorrectly, but we can pass that function to our help desk by offsetting where that trigger is. So they get the confirmation that it's done based off them placing that account into that group at the very beginning. And in the off chance that this doesn't come through, they can actually use Okta admin to look at the user's profile to see if they still have groups assigned, see if the account's active. There are a number of different ways to confirm, but this is the easiest one. And I had mentioned when I started, this process took me about 40 minutes to do, and then I got comfortable, and then it took me about 20, and now this takes 3, and it takes about 15 seconds worth of effort. So that's a lot of time. When we can, add that all up across a year, I might get a whole week of my life back not having to go deactivate, suspend, delete, transfer. I don't have to do any of that now. This is the goal. This is something that every one of us, regardless of how we trigger it, is going to end up in the same exact result. Everything's documented. There's logs of everything. We know when it happened, how it happened, all of that stuff, and it makes life a lot easier for us. So there are some bonuses to this as well. We can trigger based off deactivation. So we also have another sort of workflow that's triggered based off that workflow. And what this does is it places the computer into a table within Okta workflow, like a tiny little database. It marks the time, it marks the user, and then it says in 45 days, I'm going to check to see if you're in this list. And I'm going to see if maybe it's time to take your license off you. Now we're saving money without having to do anything, which is also great. My bosses love that. So after 45 days, it'll read that table, or on a schedule really is what will happen. Once a week, it'll read the table and look for a timestamp, and it'll do a comparison. And if that time has passed, then it says, all right, we can take your license off you, gone. Now that license has come back to us, complete offboard, done with different intervals without any additional user interaction. Really, really functional for us and super helpful. We also have similar roles for Microsoft License and Microsoft Admin roles. So now we can do the same thing. And if you're looking closely here, you'll know that on the primary workflow that I showed, that's still running. The Google one is still running, and now this Microsoft is running. So you can run multiple workflows at a single time concurrently. It will not cause a problem. We do keep track of when we schedule our workflows so that we don't have them running on top of each other, but that's up to you. It is something that you can do concurrently, as I mentioned there, and this is how that helper flows, reads all of those individuals and the roles and disables that stuff. Now this last slide here is actually part of the original primary offboarding workflow, and the reason I put this at the end is because we created a custom attribute for our individuals who have admin Okta accounts. So we take their email address or their username from that account and we put it into the custom field of their primary account. So when we offboard their primary account at the very, very end, when it's basically inconsequential, it will read that custom attribute, and if there's an email address in there, it goes, oh, okay, this person had an admin account. Let's put that admin account into the deactivation group, and that will trigger another workflow of the same exact thing, and you can waterfall these so that in something that best case scenario would take me 40 minutes to offboard 2 accounts, I'm now doing it in 3 or 4 minutes with, again, the same amount of effort, 15 seconds to get in there. So pretty cool stuff for us. These are some of the resources that we use for this presentation, some of the things that we like in general. But we appreciate everybody coming out today. If you have any questions, we're more than happy to answer anything you might have for us. Thank you. I gotta get you the box so that YouTube can smash that like button.
First, this workflow is gorgeous, and package it and sell it. It's- so it should cover like 90% of most people's needs for onboarding, offboarding there, and the only thing left is to kill their Microsoft account afterwards. So
We've got that too. Actually, I'm
Nice.
glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
So what I didn't mention, and I should have, is any deprovisioning that you have as part of your Okta activation, deactivation, as part of that process, that still happens. This doesn't isolate that. So if you have Microsoft set to deprovision correctly at the app level within Okta, that will still occur. This is for all the little tedious stuff that's just nonsense that nobody wants to do. Sorry, Sadiq. It's just the way that it is. So we have this balance where we can more or less have our cake and eat it too.
I love it. I only have one little minor note for you. Your example email address, null.com, is an actual valid domain name. You may want to consider changing that to the ICANN generic domain of example.com,
Okay.
and then you'll be set, and there won't be any chance of any potential data exfiltration.
That's a great call. I appreciate that. We'll absolutely make that change. Thank you very much. Anyone else? I'm really good at this, I guess. There we go.
So, I can't guarantee this is going to make it to you. There you go.
Do you have a HRIS system upstream, and does somebody in HR trigger the offboarding, and is there a time that they
So
set?
this has been a point of contention for us. We actually also just changed our HRIS system, so that's a whole different Okta workflow that we're
Same, I
actually.
feel your pain.
What? I'm sorry.
Same, I feel your pain.
Yeah, so we actually need a new way because it doesn't integrate with Okta. So we are going to have to build an Okta workflow to make it do that. We would like to create that process so that we can enable HR to do that. But what we've found is there is not enough consistency in the timing of certain offboardings. So what we would like to do, we have a checklist in our ticketing system that allows us to mark off and make sure all these things are done. We would like to integrate those two things together. But what has happened from time to time is user will be offboarded August 1st. They don't update the ticket, they add a comment. User will now be offboarded August 31st. So if we build that automation based off what they provide us, we just terminated somebody 30 days early, and we don't have that confidence yet, but we are always open to suggestions and ideas. We've considered maybe some forms that would make it a little bit more deliberate, that we could pass that data from, originally would have been a Google form, but now it would be from Microsoft into the workflow. But I wish I had a better answer for you. I can tell you it can be done. I can't tell you we can do it right now.
We're considering it, but it's scary.
So it looks like the workflows are really sort of an example of a no-code, low-code solution, which really underneath it's code, but it's like creating it. You've got training wheels on to
Yep,
keep
exactly.
you from, going off into the ditch or whatever. But that makes it at least. I guess my question is there a way to look at a workflow that doesn't involve scrolling through lots of pictures? In other words, can I see like a text representation of the workflow?
So you can't see the text. The closest we can come to is that flowchart I showed earlier. And I had mentioned that isn't always great.
Right.
So the one that I showed was one of the ones that Ventura gave us an example of. This is the one they provide
Yeah.
for mine. So, and that's as good as it gets. That's plus 500%.
So that would be like a feature request to ask Okta is, hey, can you show us a text?
Yep.
Because then the great thing about a text representation is you could stick it in Git and you could like.
Yep, exactly.
You could go, hey, somebody changed it. What did they do? Whereas
Yeah.
how do you
So
find changes with something
I'm the
like that?
type of person that will try to open any file with a text editor. I just want to see what I can see, and I made this mistake last week because I thought maybe a question like this would come up. And I use Code Runner primarily. I like it best. If you don't like that, that's your problem. I opened my offboarding one and it ate up 32 gigs of RAM, and I couldn't use my computer for 15 minutes. So I don't think there's that much going on, but there's enough there that maybe I don't know who has the resources for that, but I don't know the answer to that exactly. If there is a good one, I don't have it.
All right, thank you.
I think this gentleman back here.
Oh,
You know what? Actually, you know what? Let's do this. So you can't see it. You can't. I'm revisiting your question. You can't see it the way we would all like to see it, the before, but we can see the after. So when those API calls are made, Okta Workflows will put that in the output, so you can go and see it exactly there. And in theory, you could take the time to scroll through all of that and pull it apart and create it. But again, not the way I think we would all prefer to see it.
Well, actually, just to your point about the Git stuff, you can actually export workflows. It's a proprietary extension from Okta. It's not really human readable, but you can export it, and then I upload them all to Git so I can track the changes. And if someone nukes a workflow, I can just roll it back because you could import and export. So that's one thing we do. But I was going to say for offboarding, we use a / command in Slack, which is pretty handy.
Mm-hmm.
So we wrote a little bot that you can pass an email to, and then workflows ingest that, and that's what triggers the offboarding workflow, because our HRIS system, we don't want to put too much trust in our people team to offboard people correctly on the tech side, so we have that one manual step, so that works well. It's just
Yeah, and see, that's an excellent point there, because I don't want anybody leaving this discussion thinking that Okta Workflows is like, this is how these things happen. Okta Workflows doesn't really do anything. You tell it what to do. It's just a framework. So we and him have very different ways of doing the same exact thing, but it works differently for everybody. So whatever you like, you can tailor specifically to you. So I'm a huge fan of Okta Workflows. Their support is awesome when you have something to demonstrate. If you call them and say, I need a workflow to do this, they say, sure, we'll schedule some time, you can pay us to do that. If you bring them something, they go, man, this is awesome, let's do this. And they invest so much time in us and helping us that I can't speak any higher than that for them. You got 4 minutes. Conference is coming to a close. Last chance for almost a year. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I definitely appreciate it. I hope this was helpful. We'll put this back up on the screen. If anybody wants to get in contact with any of us, this is our information. More than happy to discuss it with anyone at any time. Thank you all again.
Thank you, everyone.